David Sirota, a journalist, writer, he created the movie Don't Look Up. Yeah, Don't Look Up. I saw that on Netflix, right? And one thing about David Sirota is like every now and then he'll have really good takes. He kind of reminds me of Robert Reich in a sense where they're really good at explaining what the problems are. They're really good at explaining the problems with the system, capitalism, all the things that working class people have to struggle with and battle with in this country. But then when it comes time to make a decision whether or not to leave this two-party system, that is where David still wants to try to find a way to defend the Democratic Party or defend Joe Biden or to just keep you in the two-party system. And that is the critique that I have about David Sirota. Now, he had a conversation on The Hill Rising about Joe Biden and the presidency and what we should do come November 2024. I would have this conversation with David Sirota myself, but David Sirota blocks anyone who disagrees with him on Twitter. Like, it's just reality. I got blocked by this guy like a long time ago. And I'm just like, okay, whatever. And I did reach out. So I would have this conversation with him face to face. But apparently he doesn't want to talk to people that disagree with him. So this is how we have to do this. This conversation here that David Sirota had on Rising tells me that we still have a long way to go, that people still believe that there is some type of way to win through the two-party system, in particular in reference to this conversation, the Democratic Party. Let's dive in.
You examine a lot of smaller, I would say, like lower level instances of Democratic blockage, right down to this instance, which I had forgotten about, where a Democratic candidate in Michigan was offered $20 million to drop out of his current race and run against Rashida Tlaib. What's going on here?
Well, look, I think overall the culture of the Democratic Party has shifted to one that is explicitly hostile to primary contests in general across the board. I mean, this is a party that had vigorous primary contests all the way up, as far as I look at it, until 2008. I mean, people tend to forget that the 2008 presidential contest, it was supposed to be kind of a coronation for Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama ran a tough primary against her, and she ran a tough primary against him.
We're going to go ahead and chime in here. So here's the first problem that I noticed. So let's say the good thing first. The positive about this, again, I told you he's really good at explaining the problems. Like, he'll tell you what the problems are. Yes, the Democratic Party does have a problem with primary challengers, but he doesn't go a step further and tell you the Democratic Party doesn't have a problem with money, though. The Democratic Party has a problem with anyone who tries to challenge the status quo. That is the big issue. Okay, because if you're someone that's not trying to challenge the status quo, if you're not their, chosen person, or you are their chosen person or whatever, at the end of the day, they're looking for someone that is going to keep things the same, someone that's not going to move too far to the right or too far to the left, even though the Democratic Party is pretty much still a right-wing party. But that's what they're looking for, someone who is status quo. This discussion here about the presidential election in 2008 with Barack Obama running against Hillary Clinton, he is correct when he says that the chosen person was actually Hillary Clinton. That was supposed to be her, way in. That was supposed to be her year. And then Barack Obama basically started to rise and basically begin to outshine Hillary Clinton. But I think this is not the best comparison when you're talking about the presidential election and the Democratic Party for 2024. The candidates that were running in the Democratic Party, Marianne Williamson, I forgot the guy's name. Damn. What's the other guy's name? Oh, this is bad. Oh my God, I can't remember his name. Marianne Williamson. This is really bad. Is it Dave? Dean Phillips. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for the save. That was bad. Marianne Williamson, Dean Phillips, and originally RFK Jr. before RFK Jr. left and ran independent. The difference between 2008 and 2024 is that in 2008, the incumbent was not a Democrat. In 2008, you got to remember, this is coming off of the heels of George W. Bush's presidency. So the president in the White House at that point in time was a Republican. George W. Bush wasn't running for re-election. Obviously, you can't run for re-election. Can't do it the second time, right? In a row. So this is why I don't like when people make that comparison to 2008. You can't compare the two. In 2008, there were multiple people that were running in that presidential race. Don't forget, Joe Biden was also one of the candidates in that presidential race, along with Hillary Clinton and along with Barack Obama. But the sitting president at that time was a Republican president who was already on his second term and could not run for re-election. This time around, it is very different because Joe Biden, who is a Democrat, is running for re-election. So the people who were challenging Joe Biden, they were challenging someone who is an incumbent and is running for re-election. That is a big difference between Hillary Clinton was the chosen person, but Barack Obama started to do well and he was the one that won. That was different because at the end of the day, they were just trying to get a Democrat in and get the Republicans, out. They didn't want a Republican to win again. So I don't think that's a fair comparison. Let's continue.
And this was considered all part of normal politics. This is no longer considered really a normal part of Democratic Party politics. That primary challenges up and down the ballot are not seen as something that strengthen potential general election nominees, but they are instead looked at as things that weaken candidates that should be avoided because it's a display of a back and forth fight over ideas, which supposedly weakens the party. I tend to see it the other way. I guess that makes me kind of old school, that I think that primaries are the thing that battle test your candidates before they become the general election nominee. But that culture has been kind of wrung out of the Democratic Party. And the problem is, when it comes to the presidential election, you now ended up with you've ended up with a nominee who didn't go through a tough primary, Joe Biden, who didn't really have to articulate much of a sharp political message for the last few years here, who is now the nominee, who is very unpopular and who is having to play a lot of catch up on some of the issues that he could have been sharpening himself on when it comes to politics and the election. Could have been sharpening that message, but that didn't happen because there was no primary. There was no real primary.
But why was that? See, this is where you have to go a step further. There was no real primary because, once again, the DNC made that decision. They were the ones that decided that there would not be primary debates. The DNC, again, what did we learn from the DNC fraud lawsuit? It's a corporation, right? So big money interest and the military industrial complex, they are the ones that are controlling the DNC. The DNC is controlling the Democratic Party, and they were the ones that made the decision that Joe Biden is going to be the nominee, regardless if he has primary challenger or not. See, this is where you have to go a step further and you have to call out the corruption and you have to call out the money interest. And this piece is missing from a lot of discussions. This is why Eric created something called, money, demands, solutions. This is why he created that. Because a lot of times we would see people talk about the problems, but they don't get to the root cause of it and then how you get around that. I think that's important to mention.
What do you say to Democrats who say, well, this is just because Biden is the incumbent, there's not going to be a primary this time. If there was no incumbent president, then we would have a real contest, but there wasn't a real primary, a movement against Barack Obama when he ran for re-election, that's really the issue. What's your response to that?
Well, look, you could certainly make that argument if the incumbent was relatively popular. But if we look back on the last 30, 40, 50 years of history, oftentimes when incumbent presidents are as unpopular as Joe Biden is in the polls, and we can discuss whether it's fair that he's that unpopular, but as a matter of fact, he is unpopular in public opinion surveys, that in the past, incumbents like that have faced vigorous primary challenges. I mean, Eugene McCarthy ran a vigorous primary contest against Lyndon Johnson. Ronald Reagan ran a very tough primary against Gerald Ford, who was very unpopular in 1976. Ted Kennedy ran a primary challenge against Jimmy Carter. Pat Buchanan ran a primary challenge against George H.W. Bush. So the point is that it's in some ways ahistorical that a president who is as unpopular as Joe Biden did not face a serious primary contest. And I think we have to ask ourselves, well, if it's ahistorical, then what really has changed? And I think that basically Democratic Party leaders and Democratic Party aligned media have done a very good job of selling rank and file Democratic voters on the idea that primaries should be looked at as a form of sedition and apostasy. Something disgusting and terrible, rather than part of the small d democratic process.
But why is that? See, this is the part that is not mentioned. You got to think back to the way things used to be. Think back to before we had super PACs, before we had PACs, before we had big money interests in electoral politics. Who's choosing the candidates? Wall Street, the military industrial complex. These are the things that are important to say. I think David knows this, and I don't understand why he's not saying this. You can't be in this field for this long covering politics. You worked on the Bernie campaign and not make the money and corruption connection. And that part is very important. So I think, again, what is happening is that David isn't telling you that, because David also later on, as you see in this discussion, he still wants you to participate in the Democratic Party. That's why. So if you call out the money and the corruption, then that is going to turn people away from that, or at least some people away from that. But if you're still trying to get people to play within the system, you're not going to expose those things. And that is very important for people to understand. And you also have to understand as well, Joe Biden's approval rating is lower than Donald Trump's was when he was up for re-election. They said it's lower than Bill Clinton. These are just the data that I looked at. Lower than Barack Obama, lower than George W. Bush. So it's not necessarily people who are making the decisions. Big money interest has made those decisions.
David, I can see some listeners look at the examples that you offered and say, well, those incumbents that had primary challenges against them didn't fare so well, and so maybe we should protect Biden against that from that eventuality. However, another way to read that is to say those incumbents got meaningful primary challenges because they were already showing a vulnerability. And perhaps if the political environment were more realistic about the need to sub in someone who could potentially be stronger, then there might have been a better outcome for the party in those instances. I mean, how are you reading this, and what do you think that Joe Biden's most significant vulnerabilities are that could potentially have been shored up by a primary contest or by a different candidate in particular? I know that you talked somewhat about Newsom kind of flirting with the candidacy in a kind of a shadow primary this year.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to run back the counterfactuals, right? Did those incumbents lose because they were already weak, and that's why they got a primary challenge? Or did they lose because they got a primary challenge? I mean, I don't think it's the latter. I don't think those incumbents lost their bids for re-election because they faced a primary. And again, I go back to 2008, right? 2008 was a vicious primary, right? Obama and Clinton really vilified each other. And I don't think that weakened the eventual general election nominee. Just like
Pause. Again, I'm sorry. This is a horrible example to use. Hillary Clinton was not an incumbent. Barack Obama was not an incumbent at that point in time. He keeps bringing up 2008. The person in the White House at that point in time was George W. Bush, a Republican. That is not a good example. I don't know why people keep using the example of '08, but you can't use that to compare what's happening right now in 2024 with Joe Biden. You really cannot. This is a different situation. So I'm not sure why he keeps using that example.
I don't think Bill Clinton in the 1992 primary was weakened by the very tough back and forth in that race. So I don't really buy that. But I guess nobody can really approve which way is the other. You have to run history back. But I would say this on your question about what Biden might have faced in a primary. I think Biden might have been forced to sharpen his economic message in the way that you saw him sharpen it in the State of the Union. Look, I thought the recent State of the Union address was a very good speech by Biden, an economic message that was strong. He has a decent economic story to tell about.
Let's jump in here. This is why he's not willing to call out the money and the corruption. So you see the pivot here. You see how he's trying to defend Joe Biden. He's calling out the fact that they weren't willing to allow him to have a serious primary challenge, meaning they weren't willing to allow debates, etc. But at the same time, he's also telling you that Joe Biden has a good economic story to tell. How many of you believe that? David Sirota is telling you that he needs to sharpen his economic story. Now, you got to remember, David Sirota was a speechwriter, right? Didn't he write speeches for Bernie Sanders? He was Bernie Sanders' speechwriter. Okay, so he's looking at this from the point of view as someone who wrote speeches instead of looking at the actual economy, instead of looking at the grocery prices, the gas prices, inflation, people losing their jobs, people being kicked off of unemployment because of Joe Biden. Joe Biden cutting Medicaid last year. Joe Biden cutting SNAP benefits. He's not looking at any of those things. He's repeating Democrat talking points, telling you that basically Joe Biden has to find a way to tell the message better. Tell the message better to people who are struggling to pay their rent. Tell the message better to people who got evicted after the pandemic. Tell the message to people who are struggling to pay for childcare. He's repeating those talking points. By doing that, he is giving people the impression that Joe Biden has a good economic story to tell. That is disingenuous.
His specific policies and about how the macroeconomy is better than it could be. He has a story to tell. He hasn't really had to tell it. Now, you could argue that perhaps he can't tell it, that he's just not a good enough politician, or he's an 81-year-old guy who's lost some skills. You could argue that, but the way to find that out, if you're a Democrat, where you'd want to find that out, is in the primary, where there's a potential replacement candidate if the potential incumbent cannot sell that message inside of his own party. But because there wasn't that primary contest, a really contested primary, now we're in a general election situation where if you are a Democrat and you want the Democrats to win, and you don't want Donald Trump to be president, now you're stuck with a nominee who really wasn't tested.
So let me just jump in here for a second. Thank you for saying this as well, Dritz. Record homelessness. Yes, we got to remember that homelessness actually increased by like 25% last time I checked. These are things that are very important to mention. But David Sirota tells you that Joe Biden has a good economic story to tell, but he doesn't tell you what that is. Why is that? He doesn't tell you what Joe Biden has done great for the economy, for your wallets, for your bank accounts. He hasn't had a chance to tell the story, David Sirota says. How many times has a mic been put in the front of Joe Biden's face? He's given many opportunities. He's had many opportunities to tell this story, to tell the story that he feels Joe Biden should tell. He's had multiple opportunities. That is a lame excuse. And you cannot sit here and use that excuse for the reason why Joe Biden hasn't used the time that he's had in front of the microphone to articulate what he feels he has done for the American people economically. This is the story that David Sirota is paid to tell. When you have a Democrat politician in the fam, of course you are going to still support the Democratic Party, regardless if they're wrong, regardless if Joe Biden is not doing a good job. That's what David Sirota is paid to do.
Let me ask you this, David. Do you think that there's any chance, as some have speculated, there was a big Ezra Klein story about this maybe a month or so back now, that there could be a swapping out at the convention of who the Democratic candidate is? And if so, I mean, I wonder if you have any speculation about who a replacement for Joe Biden could or should be in that instance.
Listen to this.
It's hard for me to imagine Democratic Party culture, and I want to really hone in on that for a second. What we've been talking about, it's hard for me to imagine that Democratic Party culture, which has become a culture, a top-down culture, which has been Democratic rank and file, especially activists, have been sold on the idea that the party elders, the party bosses, the party elites choose nominees, and challenging them, questioning them, really pushing them on anything is bad. It's hard for me to believe that out of that process comes a convention in which there's a new nominee. Now, of course, Biden could say, I'm not going to run again. I guess he could say that, and there would be that process. And look, I think there are plenty of very strong and well-positioned Democratic candidates to run for president, some of whom I agree with, some of whom I don't agree with on all of the issues, right? Forgetting about are they conservative Democrats, progressive Democrats, or the like. I mean, you've got governors in Pennsylvania, you've got governor in Michigan, you've got a governor in, I think, Washington State, Jay Inslee, who I think is very good on climate, for instance. I think you've got Ro Khanna, who is a House member. I mean, the list, it's a long list. Gavin Newsom, you mentioned, right? I mean, there's a long list, and I'm not saying I agree with all of them or any of them, et cetera, et cetera. My point is there are potentially strong candidates there, but it's hard for me to imagine that a convention process even allows for that kind of debate. I mean, it's just not the culture of the Democratic Party. It's not a very small d Democratic culture.
He's right. It's not the culture, but again, he doesn't tell you why, and that's because of the money and the corruption and who controls the party. But the point that he made here when he mentions Ro Khanna, governor of Michigan, that's Gretchen Whitmer, these people that he's mentioning, and he tells you that these are strong candidates. What about them makes them strong? What is it about them that makes them a strong candidate? I'm really curious to hear from you guys about this, because we have to be careful about people just picking other people and just saying that they're strong and not giving you reasons why. I mean, Ro Khanna has flip-flopped on foreign policy, especially with Gaza. So let's think about that. I mean, how do you really know about these people? Oz is telling you Inslee's the one in Washington State. Inslee sucks on everything. He thinks he's great, I guess, because he's good on climate. What about these individuals make them a strong candidate? You got to give reasons for that, right? So if all of these people that he just mentioned in any way, shape, or form are in bed with the Israeli lobby, in any way, shape, or form are afraid to criticize the Israeli lobby, in any way, shape, or form has pledged some type of allegiance to the state of Israel, is that a strong candidate at this point in time? I would say no. I would say hell to the no. But this is where we are. So these are the things that we got to look into. You can't just say someone's a strong candidate because they're good on climate. And are they in bed with the Israeli lobby? Are they taking money from big pharma? Right? Are they a part of the military industrial complex? These are questions that need to be asked. Let's go on a little bit more here.
And can you speak maybe briefly to an issue that we've talked about in some other segments today, which is that the kind of legal efforts that the Democratic Party has undertaken to restrict ballot access for third-party candidates, be they Green Party candidates like Jill Stein or independent candidates like RFK Jr.?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the classic case of both parties. This is really the characteristic of what's called the duopoly, that the duopoly doesn't want to make it easier for challengers to run outside of the duopoly's own system. I mean, that is a basic self-interest on the part of both parties. So it's not surprising. It's something that we should expect from both major parties. They are the monopoly or the duopoly, so they're trying to protect their market share. I think ultimately, though, the dissent is going to go somewhere. And this is a really important point, that you can suppress dissent and you can be successful in the short term at suppressing dissent. In the Democratic Party, for instance, you can cancel primaries, you can make ballot access harder, you can change the rules to kind of front load primaries. You can do all that. And in the short term, the dissent suppression probably can work at some level. But over the long haul, that dissent is going to go somewhere. And the problem with not having a contested primary where that dissent can at least be expressed is now you run the risk of having that dissent expressed in a general election arena in which the expression of that dissent in outside of the two parties could end up boosting somebody like Donald Trump.
There it is right there. He said all that word salad just to get to that point right there. So here is David Sirota instilling fear on the viewers that third party and independent candidates are not the way to go, even if you do have that dissent against Joe Biden. So you see how that works? So you see what he's doing? Nothing about their platforms, nothing about their message, nothing about the fact that not taking corporate money, nothing about the foreign policy, where these candidates stand on foreign policy, nothing about those things, nothing about where they stand on the issues. Just the fact that, well, if you support them, then you're helping Donald Trump. David Sirota is a Democrat hack. David Sirota writes very well. I will say he produces great articles. He's a great writer. I think that's where he should stay. Because when it comes to strategy, let's remember he was against force the vote. He was against it. He got that whole thing wrong and then still was against it, even though he was proven that he was wrong. So this is not someone that I would go to for strategy, right? So at the end of the day, people like David Sirota are there to keep you in the system that currently exists. I don't care if he wrote speeches for Bernie Sanders. David Sirota is there to make sure that you don't go somewhere else outside of this two-party system, that you stay within the Democratic Party. And I believe that when you have a family member that is a Democrat politician, it all sort of makes sense. We'll finish up with this here.
Now, I'm not making a value judgment on how people vote. Like, people have to choose how they want to vote in a general election. That's their choice. There's different logics and there's different arguments on both sides. But the point is, if you as a party suppress dissent in your own intra-party arenas, primaries, then you're running the risk of that dissent going somewhere else in a general election.
Wise words of wisdom that the Democratic Party should perhaps listen to. Not sure that they will. Thank you so much for joining us today, David Sirota. And can you tell us a little bit where people can find you at The Lever?
Yeah, so then they get into the Lever thing. He's working at The Lever. But the thing is that we have to be careful when we hear these messages from people like David Sirota. And they're very good at doing this dance, where they will call out the issues. They'll call out what's wrong with the Democratic Party. But then when you try to propose any other type of strategy, moving away from the two-party system, they will also say the same thing that the DNC says, that mainstream media says, which is that you're going to help Donald Trump. So, but I don't want to tell people how to vote, but you're going to help Donald Trump. You got to be careful about people that spew that type of rhetoric, because what they're doing is keeping you where you are. And I think in this society, given what's happening with the economy, given what's happening in reference to foreign policy and just how fed up people are with the US government, I think now is the time for people to break away from this duopoly and do something different. And we can't do that with people like David Sirota trying to still fearmonger you, making excuses for Joe Biden, and repeating mainstream media talking points. That we cannot do. Let's go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, Heidi. Love you, Sabby, for speaking the truth. Thank you so much. Shout out to Cool Blue. After his usual song and dance, Sirota votes Democrat. Exactly. And it's just, think about it. He was Bernie's speechwriter, and Bernie did the same thing. Bernie tells you all the problems, but at the end of the day, he keeps you exactly where you are. Jamie says lower than Bush. Yes, they went over the numbers actually on MSNBC. They showed the data that's how low Joe Biden's rating is. So when George W. Bush was up for re-election, his approval rating was still higher than Joe Biden. JB says, sharpen his message. How about Biden sharpen his actions and policies? Nothing about Biden is sharp. Just watch him walk a flight of stairs. Thank you for that. Shout out to Spark. He says Sirota is trying to convince himself. You can see that. Carmen says, does this guy have an economic story to tell? What is his income and his social C? I think you mean social class, maybe. Thank you, Natalie. Record homeless and 15.1 million empty homes, right? How is that a great economic story, right? Thank you, Sparky. Newsom Kushner 2024. That'd be interesting. Shout out to Chris C. If Biden touted an honest economic message, it would destroy the narrative of Bidenomics. Trump would easily have a layup to the basket. Sir Pun LOL. Sir Pun? Thank you for this, New York. I always argue with Sabs about people who do things different from her are not always paid shills. This dude, question mark, does nothing for my argument. Weasel. Thank you, Sparky. Great work. Love, Sabby. Love. Thank you. And thank you, Hayung. Love your show. Thank you so much. And welcome. All right.